Hello, guys and gals, me Mutahar, and it seems like a game is dying today, ladies and gentlemen. Anthem's dying on January 12th of this year. So yeah, we've got a wild start to the year, ladies and gentlemen. Now, again, you might be like, whoa, what's Anthem, Muta? If you haven't played Anthem, I probably talked about this shit over 6 years ago. This game is actually considerably old. It's an online-only MMO, like, looter-style game from Electronic Farts and the fellows over at BioWare, and it probably was the biggest tank that I think, the actual company has experienced, right? Like, but Anthem was not a successful experience. It's an online-only experience, and unfortunately, for the 3 people that are still playing it, it's dying. Now, I wanted to talk about this a little bit in the context of, things like stop killing games, because, as you all know, game preservation is very important to me. I like being able to own my games, okay? I own a lot of physical media for my video games simply because I think that if you spend $60 on a product, you should actually own what's on the disc, cartridge, whatever the medium of transportation is. That's just basically my belief. I don't think we should ever normalize a world where you go to a store, you buy a game for 60 goddamn dollars, and you know that it comes with an actual, death sentence, right? Like, especially when it comes to online-only video games. I know that a big chunk of people are like, but Muta, do you not have the internet? It's not about not having the internet. I have probably one of the best internet packages in my entire country. Probably some of the best internet you can get in the entire world. But that doesn't stop when websites go down, servers go down, or when game developers and publishers decide, yeah, we're not seeing a return on investment, so we're just gonna shut down those game servers. Basically making it so that $60 purchase you made effectively becomes a waste of time. Now you could say, but Muta, what if you enjoyed your hours of play? Yeah, I did, okay? What if I did? But what if I want to go back to that game maybe like in 20 years and 30 years? You might be like, well, who plays old games, Muta? Are you looking at my fucking desktop, brother? Half these games are older than the people watching the video right now. So yes, people do play older video games. Simple as that. Now this game is going down, and I've seen a lot of people kind of talk about, oh man, this game could have been saved. This game could have been amazing. Why are we losing it? Now, I'm not going to just sit here and pretend to you guys that, oh man, this really, is making me sad. It's tearing my, heart out. It's tearing me apart. No, it's not. To be real with you, Anthem was not a game that I think many people were playing. I certainly was not playing this game. But, it's one of those things where once, companies start taking things away from you, all of a sudden interest becomes renewed and you're like, wait a minute, I won't get the chance to experience this game again. So just for the people watching, I downloaded this game again underneath a virtual machine, not for any particular reason, just because I don't like fucking around with the EA application underneath Linux. I downloaded the actual, game. I played it actually. Some people were saying that they couldn't download the game that, by the way, they had access to. They couldn't even play it for the last few days the game was available. But I managed to get the game, and frankly, it's about as exhilarating as I remember. Now, there is one cool thing about this game, which is the flight mechanic. If you ever wanted a Iron Man simulator experience, this is that game, ladies and gentlemen. It's that guy. This is the guy. Now, generally, when it comes to most of the gameplay, it really is just about doing missions again, getting the best loot possible, doing the same bullshit side quests, and basically playing what is in fact a live service game. Now, did this game need to be live service? Absolutely not. I firmly, at the bottom of my core, can tell you right now that I think 99, if not 100% of the game's processing could be done locally on my computer, on PlayStation, on Xbox, on whatever this game is available on. And it could have been a fine single-player game where I could have possibly just invited a few friends into a session and played with them. This did not need to be an online-only experience. This does not need to be a live service experience. Anybody saying that doesn't really understand how powerful and capable these systems were anyways. This could have just been a pretty banger single-player game, and 20 years from now, people could have came back and played it and probably considered it to be some level of a cult classic. No, this is a perfect example of a game that didn't fucking need to be online to begin with. And it's not the only online shit that EA has made that doesn't need to be online. One of my favorite games from EA, Need for Speed 2015, literally could just be Underground 3. One of the best Need for Speed titles is unfortunately tied to life support by EA. Anytime they want to turn off the servers, this game is completely fucking gone. Now you could be saying, "What, Muda? Couldn't they patch Anthem and make it so that it's offline only?" Yeah, they could, but this is electronic farts, motherfucker. It's like Ubisoft. Do you think they're gonna do it? You know, these are intelligent decisions that you're talking about. These are actual good things for the consumer. They are not going to waste their time doing it. And I'm not going to sit here with hope coming into my body. I'm not going to be injecting copium into my soul like I'm the Half-Life community. They're not going to do it. Now, there are situations where, you know, if you look at Stop Killing Games, one of the first, like, one of the games that sort of like brought this like movement into real question from Ross from Accursed Farms was a game known as The Crew. Now, for anybody that doesn't know The Crew is a game where you basically have this giant map that represents the United States, and, you know, it's a racing game, so you're allowed to drive from like point to point, yada, yada, yada. Ubisoft did this thing where the game was online only, even though a vast majority of the game could be played by yourself. Now, Ubisoft, you know, with their billions of fucking dollars, didn't decide to jump in and, you know, patch the game for offline capability, but thankfully the community kind of jumped in and they produced what is known as the Crew Unlimited project. So let's say that you have a copy of the game sitting around on your system, you know, from whatever, you can actually run this small little server file and you can actually create a private server that you can connect the game to locally. Meaning that for anybody that never got to play The Crew, you know, now you want to actually experience a game that is unavailable officially, you can play the game. And it works pretty well. You know, it's to a point where, you know, it reminds me of back when I was a kid, like when I was younger, playing a game like World of Warcraft with a monthly subscription fee. You know, when you're a kid with an income of 0, it's not something that you're going to be putting time towards. And also, you know, buying things online, at least for a kid back then, was not as simple as I guess it is now. So honestly, back in the day, I needed to use options where I played private servers of World of Warcraft. For a while, I found out how to download private server files and play World of Warcraft locally. So I used to play this MMO by myself, and I had a pretty goddamn good time. I even learned how to use SQL to like make custom items and quests and stuff too. So this actually did have a pretty strong feeling for me at the time. Like, I actually understand the value of private servers. There's a lot of multiplayer games like Drift City, which I'm able to play because, you know, communities have brought it back through private servers. And unless companies like Mosingsoft bring this back officially, which maybe they will, because they have it on Steam for some reason, these are all situations where ultimately I want to see some games come back. And even if game companies stop supporting, I wish that there are always ways for the community to somehow host these projects themselves, so that in the future we can play the games that game companies have basically taken away from us. Even games like Concord, for instance, right? Concord is a game that was alive for maybe like 2 weeks, if not a month. And even though it was shut down and everything was basically fucking memory hold by Sony, a community did bring back the Concord servers. They brought it back, they reverse engineered it, they made the actual private server community and brought the game back. And you can play it. Unfortunately, Sony is basically taking out any footage of this, so, you know, it's not a situation that I want to go down into. So yeah, games are dying, okay? And in some cases, the only way to bring them back is if the game publisher or developer tries to give a shit, which some do, some really do, but unfortunately, a vast majority of game companies just don't do it, okay? Once a game is offline, it pretty much is lost media forever. And there's no way of getting it back. The only way is if you lived at that point and experienced it. And look, gaming is still somewhat in an infancy. But look, 2-3 generations down the road, it's going to be crazy. Gamers, a lot of you guys, are never going to be able to experience some of the stuff that we had growing up because things don't last forever. Server space is not infinite, okay? Especially in a world where fucking Gen AI and all this other crazy shit is vying for resources like a parasite. Now, in this entire process, I wanted to show you guys an example of, you know, a lot of these live service games that really don't need internet servers to kind of operate, or at least to the level that you think they do. So, for instance, playing something like The Crew, right? So The Crew Unlimited, I wanted to show you gameplay footage of it because I think this ultimately disproves a lot of the misinformation that comes out of, like, some of these greedy game publishers. So this is a server that I started, and for most of the game content, I can play it entirely single player. So a lot of the races that I'm doing, whether they be story or side races, a lot of the AI is obviously, as you can see, processing locally. In fact, the game's core storyline, which, I actually think is a pretty interesting storyline for its time, like it's definitely kind of, in that same vein as like Need for Speed games, like post Most Wanted. And I enjoy it. I really do think that the story for this game is interesting. It's worth a play. The actual gameplay is there. The whole map loads up. And even in the map, there's still AI that is processed locally. So you see these other NPC like drivers. The majority of the game that you would be able to experience is all there. In fact, the game's various unlockables are also accessible too, and let's say that you wanted to kind of toy around with things like the microtransactions. Well, thanks to the fact that this is a private server, you can gift yourself an unlimited amount of microtransaction currency and play around with it. In fact, basically every single functionality that you would expect from this game is available. The entirety of this game, save for some of the online, guild-related stuff, obviously that isn't accessible, like PvP with other random players, matchmaking, as you can imagine, isn't available. But the majority of the game content, basically the actual entirety of the single player component or the story mode is available. And you can play it without really any issues. In fact, it's running just fine. The best part about making this video is actually just getting to experience this once dead game, in a fashion that I think most people will be appreciative of, right? And, for something like The Crew, where you have a private server that's available, I wonder why a game company like EA couldn't have made something like Anthem accessible. Maybe they will. Again, the game is still technically active, and maybe there's a big patch coming at the end of life. But again, given that it's EA Games, you can't really be holding your breath for a company that has treated gamers with such disdain, in the past, recently, whatever. So yeah, the fact that a lot of these games exist in this live service manner, they don't really need to exist. You can run most of the game's processing locally through a server emulator. So I don't see why companies can't just do this at the end of life. Again, this is specifically for games that are sort of sold like these quasi-MMOs, but they're not exactly MMOs in the vein of World of Warcraft or, Final Fantasy XIV Online, where, they have entire online economies that sort of like blend with real players. They're not games that kind of, in my opinion, do require hundreds, if not thousands of players to really get that full effect. But even in those cases, having an offline version just to experience the game storylines and various quests that you can do, even if you're only playing with like 2 or 3 other people, would be interesting. But again, this is requiring that companies keep games alive so that people in the future can access and see what these certain games did. There's a lot of games like The Crew that don't need online services, but unfortunately, once you lose it, you lose the entirety of the game, especially something that you paid $60 for at some point. So I was kind of looking into Stop Killing Games again, right? Now, Stop Killing Games we talked about last year pretty extensively. Now, for anybody that doesn't know, Ross from Recurse Farms, a brilliant channel, fun guy, is actually somebody that cares a pretty fair bit about video games. He's somebody that really appreciates video game preservation, right? Now, if you ever watched anything from Ross, I feel a lot of kinship to him because you can find, me and him are the kind of people that look for the weirdest fucking games imaginable and somehow have them on our channels. You can look at videos that I have from like 10 years ago were on my channel. I just have like the weirdest games that are probably now lost media, simply because I do love playing obscure video games. I love video games to the point where I just love consuming as much as I can about this. It's one of the hobbies that I really do enjoy, right? I'm not going to say that, I dive away from mainstream gaming a lot. No, I just like playing video games. Even sometimes as obscure as they are. Even the most obscure MMORPG or live service experience or whatever the hell out there, I at least want to give an experience to because I want to try and see, something before it's actually gone, right? I want to just broaden my horizons. So he started this initiative known as Stop Killing Games, which Stop Killing Games for the longest time kind of remained dormant, but, it really exploded, partly due to like a lot of drama that kind of surrounded it and another creator known as Pirate Software, but also because I think a lot of gamers realize that, when big AAA companies are able to take away the purchases that we make, it's not good. So anyways, Stop Killing Games basically steamrolled a whole bunch of signatures, which, from my understanding, thankfully, I think like 3% of those were actually rejected. So it was a very successful movement. And ultimately, it was a movement that gained enough attention for it to be raised in the European Union. Now, there's a lot of stuff that has been discussed, so you can go to the Stop Killing Games website and you can actually see in their past actions what, the actual, actions they committed and what the results of those actions were. So for instance, they launched a European Citizens Initiative, an ECI, which we just talked about, and of course the signing is concluded, they're waiting on a response. They made a push to attach the issue of protections against publishers destroying games to the Digital Fairness Act, and the results are ongoing. Comments will be accepted until October 24th, 2025, which obviously has already passed, worked with members of European Parliament Niklas Ninab. Hold on, I gotta see how you pronounce this. Niklas Nihas. Okay, so that's the S. All right, that's something new that I learned. Niklas Nihas and the support of the MEP Patrick Breyer to submit questions to the European Commission on the legality of publishers destroying video games that are already sold. And so there's a lot of results. Unfortunately, in some cases, it's hopeful. Sometimes there are dead ends and yada, yada, yada. And sometimes there's issues from like the UK where they sometimes do not get anything because things end prematurely. And again, there's no answer from Parliament as of yet, especially when it comes to the EU. So yeah, it's different depending on where you go. And of course, sometimes it can be a little bit bleak, like for instance, in the United States of America, helped submit complaints for the game The Crew, and they got no response. But as they said, this was expected. Now, obviously, the big game industries are not going to be very happy with something like Stop Killing Games, because letting consumers have access to products is just simply a no-no. And of course, it sparks an entirely different level of like view where, you know, if you're not even owning these games to begin with, like, well, what the fuck is the issue with like piracy then, right? Like, ultimately, game ownership is important. Game companies would absolutely love if they could kill older media. Like, for instance, imagine if, you know, you loved The Crew 1. Now, they released The Crew 2, and they released The Crew 3, which is called Crew Motorsport. Now, imagine if you loved Crew 1 so much, but you weren't buying Crew 2. Well, nothing stops game companies without any form of restriction from saying, all right, fuck it, we'll just cut the servers off to the first game, forcing the player to go to the second game. Now, in most cases, players will bitch and moan, but they'll probably just end up buying the second game anyways because that's just the game that they play. And that's kind of the future companies would really enjoy. If they can take something away from you so you buy something else and give them more money, that's literally what they want. That's literally like the perfect golden world for them. Unfortunately, it's not a golden world for you. So of course, obviously looking at the Stop Killing Games movement, right, one of the other discussions that have come around it in the UK Parliament when they ended up actually debating this, the government unfortunately didn't budge. This is just from the UK Parliament. Now you can read it for yourself, but obviously it's not good in the sense where if we read this, for instance, the video game industry has changed a lot over the recent decades in ways that directly impact the way that the licenses are sold under law. First, video game development today is more complex, and it's done at a much greater scale than it is 40 years ago. That's true. A game like Ocarina of Time is substantially easier to make than a game like, I don't know, Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. That's not unknown. So secondly, the format of video games has shifted from physical to digital. Not entirely, there's still physical games being sold, and you know, until the entire industry shifts digital and I'm still gaming by then, especially new stuff, I'm probably just going to stick to PC or something. As a result, the approach to protecting intellectual property has changed, including the always online functionality, the most relevant to this debate, which requires games to maintain constant connections to an online server. For gamers used to dusting off their N64 to play Mario Kart, or whenever they like, or in my case, Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation without the need for a connection, that can be frustrating. But it is a legitimate practice that businesses are entitled to adopt. So it is essential that consumers understand what they are paying for. Existing legislation is clear that consumers are entitled to information that enables them to make informed purchasing decisions. So under the current UK legislation, the Consumer Rights Act 2015 requires that digital content must be of satisfactory quality, fit for a particular purpose, and described by the seller. It also requires that the terms and conditions applied by the trader to a product that they sell must not be unfair and must be prominent and transparent. The DM Competition and Consumer Act 2024 requires consumers to be clear and correct, and prohibits commercial practices that, through false or misleading information, cause the average consumer to make a different choice. So, to me, it sounds both good and bad. So for one, obviously, he's right. Games have changed. You know, we're long past the PlayStation 2 where putting in a disc and that being the content right there is all you ever needed. Now, a lot of people are buying their games through the internet, and in some cases, they're buying internet-connected experiences. But the reality of it is, how many people know genuinely that the game that they're buying is tied exclusively to the internet. Like, if you ask the average person, I'm talking about the gamer that isn't really tapped into the sphere. If you told them that, okay, you're buying something like Anthem, right? Do you know that Anthem is a game that cannot be played offline? And at some point, 10 years down the road, once you're really done enjoying this game, it's going to be taken away from you. Would that have affected the person buying the game, right? Imagine on the box if it said, this game will die at this date. They probably won't buy it, okay? It's kind of similar to like buying a pack of cigarettes. Like if you ever buy a pack of cigarettes in Canada, you'll notice that a pack of cigarettes usually will not show the branding unless it's on like the side. Like if you buy a Marlboro, the only thing that'll tell you is like Marlboro on the side. Generally, the pack of cigarettes will be coded in so many Surgeon General warnings that, you know, if somebody was really like focused on their health, they're like, yeah, I don't want to get super cancer or anything, they might not buy the pack of cigarettes, right? They may not do it. Or at least if they have seen that, they still choose to buy the pack of cigarettes, then it's entirely on them. I feel like that's kind of the argument that's being or attempted to be made here. It's like, listen, games that are always online, you know, that's just like a style of game. Now, obviously, if you put a Surgeon General warning on these games and said, yeah, they're fucking dying at some point, then I guess it's okay, which to me, I still don't agree with 100%. And we'll get to that right here. So when you go down, they kind of say that, in other words, mandating end-of-life plans to always online games, the government is sympathetic to the concerns raised. But they also recognize the challenges of delivering such aims from the perspectives of the video game industry. So the video game industry, basically when it comes to us saying, listen, if you're going to design a game, you should design a game with an end-of-life plan. And when the end of life comes, push a video game patch and then give offline functionality to the game. And, you know, the argument can be made that that's not possible for every single game. And I think that to an extent, there are some games that it's just almost impossible. Like, if I'm a purchaser and I buy something like World of Warcraft, I don't think that I'm going to be in the market of bitching to like the consumer that, or like the industry that this game should be offline supported, right? Maybe there's some games that are truly built for the offline experience. But even then, right? When I look at games like Arc Raiders, very multiplayer focused game, but when the time comes for it dying, right, I think personally there should be a way for users to have a patch push to the game where, you know, they either implement just bot functionality, you know, PvE functionality, or they just allow you to have the, you know, files and host the actual sessions, maybe peer-to-peer, something like that. Because ultimately when you pay for a product, you should ultimately own it. That's just where I kind of get down into. So they do say, first, such a change would have negative technical impacts on video game development. It's true that there are some games where it would be relatively simple to patch an offline mode. That's true. There are some games that are specifically designed for an online experience, and that would not be possible without major redevelopment. So again, they do say that some games would be simple. Games like, I would imagine, The Crew. And then obviously games like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy, you know, 11 Online. Or Final Fantasy, 14 Online, both online games, would be very difficult for them because of the nature of the game. So obviously the other thing they mentioned too is under the Online Safety Act, video game companies are responsible for controlling exposure to harmful content. Removing official moderation from servers and enabling community-hosted servers increases the risk that users, including children, could be exposed to such content. Which obviously at that point, I feel like legally, why would you even involve the company that made the game into that when they're not even like the actual server hoster, right? Like that's such a weird point that gets brought up. It is a point that has some similarities to a time when we looked at, for instance, if you remember the Club Penguin situation where a lot of, you know, groomers were running private Club Penguin servers, and at that point hullabaloo was raised to companies like Disney who own the intellectual property. Now, in that case, nobody should ever imply that Disney was the one responsible for letting children enter, you know, the most vicious corners of the internet. Really, it was the fault of the people running the servers. The only reason you really raise awareness to Disney is that, legally speaking, under the current mechanism, if you want things shut down, you know, instead of going through the police, that takes forever, it seems, you can just go directly to Disney and say, hey, listen, this is your IP and they're using it for all these terrible things. How about shut down those servers, right? It's one of those examples where you kind of use the copyright laws to some ulterior goal, right? A good goal in that case. But again, this blaming on, these companies for being responsible for private servers that are outside their control, these separations should be made very clear that ultimately no company should be responsible for what happens with their game or what happens with the private server community after they've already given out end-of-life binaries. It's just weird. But ultimately, the end, I think that there is a lot of rays of sunshine for something like Stop Killing Games. Unfortunately, I also kind of see, and this is the pessimistic side of me, I think that when it comes to game companies, they will always find a way to take away from the gamer in any capacity, right? This is not something that, I think game companies aren't somewhat prepping for. Now, the period of time that we're in is basically the calm before the storm, so a lot of the developments for Stop Killing Games have kind of been more bureaucracy than they have been the exciting stuff, getting this in movement in the first place. Now, there are some negatives here. Unfortunately, in places like Canada, for instance, the petition that was actually to the federal government, where again, they basically brought up, yeah, companies require constant internet connection for games to be playable. When companies in support, they are rendered all purchased copies unplayable. So, the actual, meat of the argument brought over here. So obviously the response by the Minister of Innovation in Canada said, the Government of Canada would like to thank the petitioners for expressing their concerns, so that's great. Government of Canada is committed to promoting the interests and protection of Canadian consumers. Okay, fair enough. Federal agencies and departments are responsible for enforcing legislations related to various issues, including consumer product safety, consumer product packaging, and labeling and anti-competitive practices. Additionally, consumer protection is a shared responsibility between the Government of Canada and provincial and territorial governments. On the specific matter of planned obsolescence of video games, the matter is best addressed at the provincial and territorial jurisdiction. So this makes it a lot difficult in Canada because now you have to specifically go to each province, which in this case would be, the most important really for the consumer market, probably the most populated. So you're probably looking at Ontario, you're probably looking at, Quebec, you're probably looking at British Columbia, and then obviously Alberta and places like that. And obviously the argument of taking this to every single province in Canada becomes incredibly difficult because then you're fragmenting people to the nth degree, and it's just never good for major whirlwind legislative cases like this. Now, obviously, when you're looking at the EU, which I think is probably the best possible place for this to happen and still can happen, because ultimately the EU is such a large economic zone that obviously if something changes in the EU, it should trickle down into the United States or any other country. Now, if you look at situations, Scott obviously said the DFA is already trying to address issues like predatory monetizations. So what they're asking for is kind of in similar territory. Now, obviously, you can say that predatory in the sense that when a game shuts off, companies take the title away from you, which should never be okay. What they want to do is add a provision, or they hope that regulators add a provision requiring publishers to leave video games they've sold to customers in a reasonably working state. Now, obviously, the video game industry, so Video Game Europe, we talked about this a while back, they said that imposing new rules could increase costs for developers and stifle innovation, since many titles are designed from the ground up to be only online, or online only. Now, you could ask why online only exists. Does the internet function and provide any specific exclusive gameplay feature that probably could not have been experienced had the game not been able to process locally? Like we said, the crew is technically online only, but a vast majority, if not most of the game, can be played completely offline. So you have to ask yourself, is the online only just a fucking DRM check? Or is it actually providing something tangible in terms of gameplay? It's interesting when they talk about this, they compare it to something like printers, for instance, right? They say that, hey, no matter how old a printer can get, it still prints documents. What we're seeing with games is different. It's as if someone brought the printer and then one day the manufacturer sent out a signal that deliberately stopped it from working at all, claiming it had reached the end of support and that is not support ending, it's just obsolescence. Which is literally like what I agree with here, right? Like if you're going to release a game, you should either on the box say at some point this will die and be inaccessible, which might actually affect sales, or I think if you're going to sell a game for $60, at the end of life, you should find some way to let people have access to that game. I'm very hard set on letting people have access to something. And honestly, I think if it harms games, harms like the worst experiences. Like if it harms games that are built to be predatory to users, to be like live service shitholes, I honestly don't really care about that. Call me an asshole about that all you want, but I think personally there should be some level of legislation or regulation that says, hey, if you're going to sell me a piece of software, let me own that piece of software at least until the end, right? At least until whenever I'm done with it. Simply because, look, if you're paying money for something, you should be able to own it. Because how far does this actually go, right? It can happen in video games, but what happens when it starts happening with vehicles, right? What happens when it starts happening with other forms of software and hardware out there, right? It's a fucked up world to live in. When you talk about stop killing games, you're also talking about things like right to repair, right to ownership. And no matter where you stand, I think as a consumer, as somebody buying this shit, you should be allowed to own whatever it is you spend your money on. Simple as that. So yeah, stop killing games. Honestly, it's still moving on. Like much legislation on the internet or like in real life, it takes a long time, and we're not done talking about it at all. But looking at things like Anthem shutting down, it's just a grim reminder of like where this live service trend of gaming is going to. So when you do buy a game, remember, just buy games that are respectful of your ownership. Like there's a lot of indie games out there, a lot of publishers, even AAA groups out there that are still making games on the disc. They're still allowing you to have access to them without any form of internet connection. There's a reason why. I am not interested for the new Halo or the new Gears of War, mostly because of the interest of generative AI crap there, but also because, for Xbox games, you can't even own them on discs anymore. They don't even print the game on the disc. They print maybe like an installer key. I haven't bought anything Xbox related at all. I haven't bought Game Pass. I haven't kept my subscription list because even when I look at subscription services, I don't want to get into a world where games are eventually going to start getting locked behind those services or behind cloud services or whatever. I am very much a game ownership kind of guy. That's why, when it comes to spending money, I spend money on fully completed games, right? I buy full discs, I buy full carts, whether it be on the Switch or whatever system. And when it comes to even digital games, right? You might be like, well, how can you talk with this bravado Muda and still use Steam? I don't just use Steam. If I can buy my games on platforms like GOG where I can own them forever, that's where I go, okay? There's a lot of ways you can still vote with your wallet and still experience the best of gaming. And I think going into the future, gamers will have to be really conscious about that. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it if you dislike it. I am out.